The Crusades were a series of religiously sanctioned military campaigns launched by Latin Christian Europe in the medieval period, primarily aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem and other holy sites from Muslim rule. These holy wars, endorsed by the papacy, combined religious fervor with political and territorial ambitions. Among them, the First Crusade, which took place between 1096 and 1099, holds a uniquely important position. It was the only crusade to actually achieve its primary goal, the successful capture of Jerusalem. More than just a military campaign, the First Crusade reshaped political alliances, ignited centuries of conflict, and profoundly influenced cultural and religious dynamics between East and West. Its echoes still resonate in modern geopolitical and religious discourse. This monumental undertaking was a convergence of religious zeal, feudal ambition, and socio-political maneuvering that would permanently transform the relationship between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. In the 11th century, Europe was a land divided by power, piety, and poverty. The feudal system dominated the continent, a rigid hierarchy in which every individual's place in society was determined at birth. At the top sat kings and nobles, their power built upon land ownership and allegiance from vassals. Below them were knights who owed military service to their lords in exchange for protection and parcels of land. The majority of the population, however, consisted of peasants and serfs. These were the laborers who worked the land, living under harsh conditions and with little chance for social mobility. Their lives were tightly controlled both by secular authority and the ever-present reach of the church. Feudalism was not merely a political system, it was the structure that dictated economic life, personal relationships, and the rule of law. The local lord was judge-governor and sometimes executioner, while the church acted as both spiritual guide and ultimate moral authority. Religion was not simply a belief system, it was the axis upon which life turned. Christianity, in its Roman Catholic form, was the dominant faith across Western Europe. The church held immense power not just spiritually, but also economically and politically. Monasteries controlled large tracts of land, bishops wielded influence over kings, and the Pope stood as a towering figure above all. This religious authority was reinforced through constant rituals, the sacraments, and fear of divine punishment. Eternal salvation was the goal, and the church was the gatekeeper. At a time when literacy was rare, most people learned about the world and their place in it through religious instruction, sermons, and local legends. But not all was stable within this tightly controlled order. Beneath the surface of Christian Europe, a growing unease was beginning to bubble. There were economic frustrations, land shortages, poor harvests, and famine all took their toll. Political instability plagued many regions as minor lords clashed with each other or resisted royal authority. In many areas, younger sons of nobles found themselves landless due to the system of primogeniture, which granted inheritance solely to the firstborn male. These landless knights were restless, skilled in warfare, and looking for opportunities to prove their valor and gain fortune. With no clear future at home, many of these men were ready to embrace any chance that offered glory, wealth, and purpose. Alongside these economic and political pressures was a deeply rooted fear of external threats, most notably the rising power of Islam. To the Christian mind, Islam was not only a different faith, It was seen as a dangerous heresy, a formidable enemy that had seized lands once considered sacred. The Muslim world was advancing scientifically, economically, and militarily. News of Islamic victories, such as their control over Jerusalem and their presence in Spain, fed a sense of crisis within Christian Europe. These were not just distant events. They were seen as affronts to God and a challenge to Christian supremacy. The call to resist Islam was as much about defending territory as it was about asserting religious dominance. The Church, always attuned to the spiritual and emotional pulse of the people, saw an opportunity. Pope Urban II and his allies recognized that the tensions within Europe, discontent among the lower classes, the ambitions of landless knights, and the growing fear of Islam could be redirected outward. By channeling this unrest into a holy cause, the Church could expand its influence, redirect violence away from internal feuds, and offer the faithful a sense of mission. The timing was perfect. Europe needed a purpose, and the Church offered one through the idea of a crusade. It promised salvation, adventure, and the chance to fight for the most sacred cause imaginable, the defense and liberation of the Holy Land. At the local level, the concept of pilgrimage had already been popular. Christians believed that traveling to sacred sites, particularly Jerusalem, was a way to atone for sins and deepen one's connection to God. Yet by the late 11th century, such pilgrimages were becoming increasingly dangerous due to political instability in the Eastern Mediterranean and growing hostility toward Christian visitors. The idea of combining the pilgrimage with an armed expedition made sense to many. It was both a holy journey and a battle for justice. This merging of religious devotion with military ambition laid the groundwork for a new kind of war, one that was justified not by personal gain, but by divine will. Furthermore, the communal mentality of medieval Europeans played a crucial role. Society was built around shared beliefs, and the fear of exclusion from salvation was deeply motivating. When religious leaders spoke of Muslims as enemies of God and of Jerusalem as a city under siege by infidels, many believed it was their personal duty to act. The promise of indulgences, remission of sins offered by the Pope, made the offer even more compelling. To die in the service of God was to achieve immediate entry into heaven, a reward far greater than anything life could offer. Thus, by the end of the 11th century, the pieces were in place for a mass mobilization. Social, economic, and religious tensions, combined with personal ambition, spiritual longing, and institutional opportunism to create the perfect storm. What began as scattered unrest across feudal Europe would soon transform into one of the most extraordinary and devastating movements of the Middle Ages, the First Crusade. It would be fueled not only by swords and soldiers, but by the deep convictions and hopes of an entire civilization struggling to make sense of its place in a changing world. While Europe grappled with its own internal divisions and religious fervor, a powerful and unified force was rising in the East: Islam. Since its emergence in the 7th century, the Islamic world had expanded rapidly, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of India in the east. The Muslim caliphates, first the Umayyads and then the Abbasids, created a vast and sophisticated civilization characterized by scientific advancement, commercial prosperity, and military strength. The Islamic empires were not only strong militarily, but also culturally cohesive, intellectually vibrant, and economically interconnected. In comparison to fragmented feudal Europe, The Islamic world was an organized, centralized power bloc with a religious mission of its own, the spread and preservation of Islam. Though peaceful coexistence and trade did occur, the expansion of Islam was perceived by Christian Europe as an existential threat to its religion, values, and territories. One of the most pivotal confrontations between the Islamic world and Christian powers occurred in the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of the Roman Empire. By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine state was weakened by internal political instability and external threats. This vulnerability was dramatically exposed in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, where the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a rising Turkic Muslim dynasty that had recently converted to Islam and embraced the cause of expanding Islamic control in Anatolia and beyond. Led by Alp Arslan, the Seljuk forces not only decimated the Byzantine army, but also captured Emperor Romanos IV, a humiliation that sent shockwaves across the Christian world. This defeat signaled the beginning of the end for Byzantine dominance in Asia Minor, a region that had long served as the empire's economic and military heartland. Following their victory at Manzikert, the Seljuks continued their advance into Anatolia, establishing the Sultanate of Rum and occupying strategic cities and trade routes. The rapid collapse of Byzantine control in the region left the empire defenseless, with its borders exposed and its political structure in disarray. Emperor Alexios the Komnenos, who ascended to the throne in 1081, understood the gravity of the situation. Without significant reinforcements, the Byzantine Empire would likely fall to further Muslim conquests. Desperate to protect his territory and reclaim lost lands, Alexios made a bold and unprecedented move. He appealed to the Christian West for military assistance. This request would change the course of medieval history. In 1095, Alexios sent envoys to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza, requesting armed support against the Seljuk Turks. While this appeal was primarily a diplomatic strategy to secure mercenaries and military aid, it also opened the door for a much broader religious and political response. The Pope saw in this request a powerful opportunity to unite the often fractured Christian kingdoms of Europe under a common cause. More importantly, it allowed the papacy to assert its authority over secular rulers by positioning itself as the supreme defender of Christendom. For Urban II, the Byzantine emperor's plea was more than a tactical alliance, it was divine providence. The threat to Byzantium was framed as a threat to all of Christianity. Reports circulated of Muslim aggression, desecration of Christian holy sites, and persecution of pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories played into existing fears and prejudices within the Christian imagination. The idea that the Holy Land, the birthplace of Christ, and the center of Christian spirituality was in Muslim hands was intolerable to many believers. This, coupled with the fall of Christian territory in the East, created a powerful sense of urgency and outrage across Europe. The time for action had arrived. Thus, the fall of Byzantine strength and the rise of Islamic expansionism set the stage for one of the most consequential events in religious and political history. The intersection of East and West was no longer a boundary, it was a battlefield. The Byzantine Empire's call for help, born out of desperation, was transformed by the papacy into a larger narrative a divine mission to reclaim not only territory, but the spiritual destiny of Christendom. What had once been a regional conflict between Byzantium and the Seljuks was about to escalate into a continent-wide mobilization, bringing together knights, peasants, nobles, and clergy from across Europe under the banner of the cross. The stage was now set for Pope Urban II to make his historic appeal to arms, which would launch the First Crusade and reshape the medieval world. In November of 1095, a pivotal moment in medieval history unfolded at the Council of Clermont in southern France. Pope Urban II, responding to the Byzantine emperor's plea for aid, stood before a vast crowd of clergy and nobles and delivered one of the most influential speeches of the Middle Ages. What began as a diplomatic request for mercenary support transformed into a sweeping, emotionally charged call for a holy war. With powerful oratory and religious authority, Urban summoned the Christian peoples of Europe to take up arms not merely in defense of Byzantium, but in a righteous mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. This call did more than ignite a military expedition. It awakened a collective spirit uniting fractured European kingdoms and inspiring tens of thousands of men and women to leave their homes behind for a cause they believed was sanctified by God. Urban's message was clear and stirring. He described the suffering of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule, painting a dire picture of desecrated churches, tortured pilgrims, and sacred lands lost to heretics. These accounts, whether accurate or embellished, were deeply effective in stirring outrage and compassion. But Urban's appeal was not grounded in grief alone, it was empowered by promise. He offered spiritual salvation to those who joined the fight. Anyone who took part in the crusade would receive a plenary indulgence, a complete remission of sins. This was a powerful incentive in a time when belief in heaven and hell was absolute, and the fear of eternal damnation weighed heavily on the minds of the faithful. The idea that war could be a form of penance was revolutionary. Until this moment, violence and killing, even in battle, were often seen as sinful, requiring confession and acts of contrition. Urban's decree flipped this moral code on its head. To fight in the crusade was not a sin. It was a sanctified act of devotion. For knights and warriors trained in the art of combat, this was a rare convergence of their earthly duty and spiritual salvation. Even for peasants who had no swords or titles, the opportunity to serve God directly, to walk the roads of Christ's own land, and to secure forgiveness was irresistible. Pope Urban II was also acutely aware of the social and political landscape of Europe. His call to arms was not only spiritual, it was strategic. By redirecting the violent tendencies of feuding nobles outward toward a common enemy, he hoped to restore peace within Europe's borders. Internal conflicts, territorial skirmishes, and rivalries between Christian lords had long destabilized the region. The crusade offered a unifying mission, one that transcended local loyalties and brought together princes, barons, knights, and commoners under a single divine purpose. It was a chance to forge a broader Christian identity and strengthen the influence of the Church across secular territories. The response to Urban's speech was immediate and overwhelming. Eyewitnesses described the crowd erupting with cries of Deus vult, God wills it. This phrase would become the rallying cry of the First Crusade, a symbol of its religious legitimacy and the fervor it inspired. Clergymen took up the cross, urging their parishioners to join. Nobles pledged their armies, peasants and tradesmen abandoned their fields and shops. Even women and children were swept up in the emotion, joining processions and preparing for pilgrimage. Urban had tapped into something profound, a combination of fear, hope, guilt, and zeal, and channeled it into the most ambitious military campaign Christendom had ever known. Urban's influence did not end at Clermont. In the months that followed, he sent legates across Europe to repeat his message in churches, markets, and town squares. They carried his words, sometimes adapting them to local contexts, always stressing the rewards of participation and the holiness of the cause. The result was unprecedented. Never before had such a large and diverse group of people mobilized for a single military purpose. From the castles of Normandy to the villages of Lombardy, Europe buzzed with preparation. Weapons were forged, supplies gathered, debts settled, and farewells made. A spiritual tide was rising, and thousands were ready to ride it to Jerusalem. This moment marked a profound shift in the role of the papacy as well. By taking the initiative in military matters and galvanizing a continent-wide movement, Pope Urban II asserted the Church's supremacy not only in spiritual affairs, but also in political and military leadership. His speech at Clermont was not merely a sermon. It was a declaration of papal ambition. The crusade was to be waged under church authority, and loyalty to the Pope became a measure of one's piety and courage. This expansion of ecclesiastical power would have lasting consequences, strengthening the papacy's role in European governance and inspiring future popes to assert similar authority in both religious and worldly conflicts. In the end, Urban II did not live to see the conclusion of the First Crusade. He died in 1099, shortly after Jerusalem was captured, unaware of the full impact of his vision. But his call at Clermont endured. It had unleashed forces that could not be turned back: military, religious, political, and cultural. The First Crusade was underway, and Europe would never be the same. Urban's words had lit a fire that would blaze for centuries, burning through borders, beliefs, and generations. What began as a plea for help had become a holy war, one that promised glory and salvation, but would also bring suffering and bloodshed on an unimaginable scale. Before the armored knights and noble banners of Europe's great lords ever set foot in the East, a very different kind of crusade had already begun. Known as the People's Crusade. This early movement was not led by kings or generals, but by charismatic preachers, most notably a fiery figure named Peter the Hermit. This wave of popular mobilization occurred in the months following Pope Urban II's call at Clermont. It wasn't organized by the Church or sanctioned by political elites, but rather emerged spontaneously as masses of common people, peasants, laborers, artisans, and even entire families responded with fervent faith and raw desperation. They believed that the path to salvation did not require royal lineage or military command. Instead, they placed their trust in divine will and the vision of reaching Jerusalem through sheer conviction. Peter the Hermit, a monk from Amiens in northern France, was central to this movement. Described as ragged, barefoot, and passionate, Peter was a compelling orator whose sermons resonated deeply with Europe's poor and dispossessed. He traveled from village to village, reportedly carrying a letter from the Holy Sepulchre and riding a donkey like a biblical prophet. His message was clear and urgent. Salvation was within reach, and it awaited those willing to journey east in God's name. His charisma stirred crowds into action. Thousands pledged to follow him, convinced that miracles would protect them and that divine favor would guarantee their success. They saw the crusade not only as a holy war, but as a pilgrimage that would cleanse their sins and change their fates forever. The People's Crusade, however, was fraught with problems from the outset. Unlike the later waves of knights and organized armies, these early crusaders were largely untrained in warfare, poorly equipped, and lacking any clear logistical strategy. There was no central leadership, no chain of command, and little in the way of planning. Some crusaders carried little more than farm tools and household possessions. Many had no money, relying on the charity of those they passed, or resorting to looting when provisions ran out. Entire communities, men, women, children, set off on foot with limited understanding of the geography, political situation, or dangers that lay ahead. Their journey through Europe quickly turned chaotic. As they traveled through the Rhineland, some groups seized by fanaticism and suspicion turned their wrath toward local Jewish communities. In towns like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, massacres occurred as crusaders demanded conversions and plundered Jewish homes and synagogues. These brutal pogroms revealed the darker side of religious fervor and marked an ominous beginning to a campaign supposedly waged for spiritual redemption. Church authorities condemned these acts, but often lacked the power to stop them. The People's Crusade, driven by zeal, but unrestrained by discipline, had already begun to spiral out of control before even leaving Europe. When the various contingents of the People's Crusade finally reached Byzantine territory, the empire was both alarmed and unprepared. Emperor Alexios I had expected professional soldiers to support his military efforts, not unruly mobs with no real leadership or coordination. Nonetheless, he offered the Crusaders passage across the Bosporus into Anatolia, hoping to move them along quickly and reduce tensions in Constantinople. Once across, however, their problems only multiplied. Lacking supplies and unfamiliar with the harsh terrain, many died from hunger disease or exposure. Others fell in skirmishes with local Turkish forces, who were quick to exploit their lack of organization and military skill. The final blow came near the city of Nicaea in Anatolia. There, the People's Crusade, now numbering tens of thousands, encountered the professional troops of the Seljuk Turks, under the command of Kilij Arslan. The Turks, having observed the disarray among the Crusaders, launched a swift and deadly counterattack. The untrained Europeans, unable to mount a coherent defense, were slaughtered in staggering numbers. Survivors were either enslaved, killed, or scattered. Peter the Hermit, who had left the group temporarily to negotiate with the Byzantines, returned to find his movement in ruins. What began as an outpouring of spiritual devotion had ended in tragedy, a sobering prelude to the far bloodier confrontations to come. Yet despite its disastrous outcome, the People's Crusade had a lasting impact. It demonstrated the intensity of religious feeling sweeping across Europe, and it underscored how deeply the call to crusade resonated with all layers of society, not just the elites. This early wave showed the Church and European leaders both the power and the danger of mass mobilization. It also served as a grim lesson in the importance of planning logistics and military structure lessons that the knights and nobles who followed would take to heart. Above all, the People's Crusade revealed the sheer desperation and hope that defined the era. For many, the crusade was not only about Jerusalem, it was about escape from hunger, oppression, sin, and hopelessness. It was about believing, even if blindly, in a cause greater than oneself. In the broader narrative of the First Crusade, the People's Crusade is often remembered as a tragic misstep, a chaotic surge of idealism crushed by reality. But it was also the spark that lit the way for what followed. It proved that tens of thousands were willing to uproot their lives and walk into the unknown for faith, redemption, and purpose. It was in many ways the soul of the crusade, raw, reckless, and resolute. In the wake of the People's Crusade's disastrous collapse, a more organized and formidable wave of crusaders prepared to journey eastward. This time it was not ragtag bands of peasants and untrained zealots who answered the call, but Europe's most powerful nobles, seasoned warriors, veteran commanders, and aristocrats of high birth. Inspired by Pope Urban II's promise of spiritual redemption and driven by a mixture of faith, ambition, and opportunity, these leaders began assembling their forces. The result was a vast, multi-pronged military campaign that would bring together some of the most influential figures of medieval Europe. Among the most prominent were Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse-Bohemond, of Taranto Tancred, Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois. These men, each commanding their own armies, would form the backbone of what would become the First Crusade. Unlike the People's Crusade, the campaigns led by these nobles were grounded in strategic planning and military discipline. Though they came from different regions, France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, they all agreed to journey through Byzantine territory, uniting their cause with that of the Eastern Christian emperor. The Pope had strongly encouraged this coordination to prevent internal rivalries from undermining the expedition. Moreover, he had insisted that the crusading lords swear oaths of loyalty to Emperor Alexios the Komnenos in exchange for supplies, safe passage, and the promise that captured lands would be returned to the Byzantine Empire. While some nobles agreed, begrudgingly viewing Alexios with suspicion, most recognized the importance of diplomacy in securing their path to the Holy Land. The scale of this mobilization was immense. Entire towns were emptied of their fighting men as lords summoned vassals, levied taxes, and sold off properties to fund the journey. For many, the crusade became a generational endeavor, with younger sons seeking their fortunes abroad, and noble houses staking their reputations on success. Families were often left behind with uncertain futures, while crusading knights embarked on a journey they believed would define not only their lives, but their eternal souls. Recruitment sermons echoed in churches across Europe, and blacksmiths labored day and night to forge weapons armor and horseshoes. What began as a spiritual call had evolved into a massive logistical undertaking. Traveling in separate contingents, the various armies began to make their way toward Constantinople. Their routes varied. Some took the overland path through the Balkans, others sailed across the Adriatic and moved inland. Along the way, they encountered both cooperation and conflict. Local rulers sometimes welcomed the crusaders, offering provisions or joining the cause. In other instances, misunderstandings, greed, or arrogance led to clashes with Christian allies. These incidents revealed the underlying tensions that plagued the movement, while the crusade was nominally united. Under one cause, it was also composed of individuals with personal ambitions and rivalries. Questions over leadership, rewards, and tactics simmered beneath the surface, even before the first battle was fought. When the various noble-led armies arrived at the gates of Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, Emperor Alexios was stunned by the scale of the arriving forces. While he had anticipated several thousand troops, he now faced tens of thousands of heavily armed warriors, accompanied by baggage trains, non-combatants, and support staff. Though the Byzantine Empire welcomed the reinforcements, Alexios feared that such a massive foreign presence could threaten his capital and his authority. To mitigate the risk, he negotiated individually with each noble leader, extracting oaths of fealty and securing promises that any territories conquered from the Muslims would be returned to imperial control. The negotiations were tense. Many Western lords distrusted the Byzantines, whom they saw as effete or even heretical, but the need for supplies and passage compelled them to cooperate. Despite these uneasy alliances, the crusading armies eventually crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor, prepared for the long and dangerous journey ahead. Their goal remained clear: to liberate Jerusalem and secure the Holy Land for Christendom. Yet even at this early stage, the crusade was revealing its complex nature. It was not a single unified army, but a patchwork of coalitions. It was not driven solely by faith, but also by politics, power, and personal ambition. Each noble leader had his own motives, his own strategies, and his own vision for what victory might look like. While they shared the Pope's vision of a Christian triumph, they also saw in the crusade a chance to gain glory, territory, and influence. The participation of so many high-ranking nobles also transformed the perception of the crusade across Europe. What had begun as a religious cause now had the full endorsement of aristocracy. The involvement of counts, dukes, and princes lent legitimacy and prestige to the movement, attracting even more recruits and increasing political pressure on kings and rulers who had remained aloof. Although no reigning monarch took part in the First Crusade, the presence of royal blood among its leaders ensured that it would be taken seriously by enemies and allies alike. The crusade was no longer a chaotic march of the desperate. It had become a military campaign with the potential to redraw the map of the known world. At the heart of this campaign was the idea of Christian unity. Despite cultural, linguistic, and political differences, the noble crusaders were bound by a shared sense of purpose. They believed that they were instruments of God, chosen to carry out a sacred mission. The journey ahead would test their faith, their resolve, and their ability to cooperate. But for now, as they left the safety of Constantinople and looked eastward across the hostile plains of Anatolia, they marched with confidence and conviction. The Holy Land beckoned, and with sword and cross, they would answer the call. As the crusading armies left the fortified walls of Constantinople behind, they entered a vast and unforgiving landscape, the rugged expanse of Asia Minor. For many Western Europeans, this foreign land was a mystery, a place of distant mountains, arid plains, and unpredictable weather. Few among them had any real knowledge of its geography or climate. The noble-led contingents, now numbering in the tens of thousands, began their eastward march with determination, but they would soon face some of the most severe trials of the entire crusade. Harsh terrain, hostile forces, and logistical nightmares quickly turned the journey into a battle for survival. The first major test came at the city of Nicaea, the former capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, and a key strategic location. Though technically promised to the Byzantines, Nicaea was now in the hands of Kilij Arslan, the same Seljuk ruler who had crushed the People's Crusade. The Crusaders laid siege to the city in May 1097, coordinating efforts with the Byzantine forces across Lake Ascania. This cooperation marked one of the rare instances of genuine collaboration between the Western and Eastern forces. After weeks of fighting and with help from Byzantine naval reinforcements, the city finally surrendered in June. However, the Crusaders were denied the chance to plunder it. The Byzantines entered first and claimed control. Many knights felt betrayed, suspecting that the emperor was exploiting their sacrifices for his own gain. The victory was bittersweet, and distrust toward the Byzantines deepened. From Nicaea, the Crusaders advanced toward Dorylaeum, where they would face their first major open-field confrontation with the Seljuk Turks. In early July 1097, Bohemon's contingent was ambushed near the city by Kilij Arslan's forces. The Seljuks, masters of cavalry warfare and hit-and-run tactics, harassed the Crusaders with waves of archers and fast-moving troops. The Europeans, heavily armored and less mobile, were vulnerable in the open terrain. Panic set in among the ranks. But just as the battle threatened to turn into disaster, reinforcements led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse arrived, turning the tide and forcing the Turks to retreat. The Battle of Dorylaeum was a hard-won victory, but it exposed the Crusaders' greatest weaknesses, their lack of unity, and their vulnerability in unfamiliar terrain. The triumph at Dorylaeum did not ease the difficulties of the march. The route through Asia Minor proved grueling. The land was dry and barren with few sources of food or clean water. The heat was relentless during the day, while freezing temperatures often swept in at night. Many men and animals succumbed to exhaustion, thirst, or illness. Horses vital to the knight's effectiveness died by the hundreds. Without reliable supply lines, the Crusaders relied on whatever they could forage or seize from local settlements, many of which had already been devastated by war. Hunger and disease spread, and morale plummeted. Even the noblest lords found themselves weakened, humbled by the harshness of the land and the weight of their own ambition. Beyond the physical challenges, the Crusaders also faced internal divisions. Rivalries among the noble leaders began to emerge more openly. Disagreements over command, spoils, and routes created tensions that sometimes threatened to derail the entire campaign. While the shared goal of reaching Jerusalem kept them moving, personal agendas and old grudges simmered beneath the surface. Coordination between the armies was difficult, and communication was often slow or confused. With no central command, the crusade was held together by fragile alliances and the charisma of a few key leaders. As they continued eastward, the psychological toll of the journey became more apparent. The initial enthusiasm and spiritual zeal that had driven the Crusaders across Europe began to fade under the weight of reality. They had expected glory, miracles, and divine favor, but found instead scorching heat, relentless hunger, and death. Some deserted the cause, entirely slipping away into the countryside or seeking shelter with sympathetic locals. Others grew more fanatical, interpreting every setback as a divine test and every small victory as proof of God's favor. Religious rituals increased in frequency, and the search for relics, visions, and omens became part of daily life. The harsh journey had not only tested their bodies, but also reshaped their spiritual understanding of the crusade. Despite these hardships, the Crusaders pressed on. Their next major goal was to secure footholds in Syria and northern Mesopotamia, where they could regroup, gather supplies, and prepare for the final push toward Jerusalem. The success at Dorylaeum had boosted their confidence, and despite the losses, the army was still strong. More importantly, the vision of liberating the Holy City, so deeply instilled by the Pope's promise and repeated in countless sermons, remained alive in their hearts. For many, turning back was not an option. They had sacrificed too much, endured too many trials, and wandered too far to give up now. The march through Asia Minor, though rarely celebrated in Romantic Crusade chronicles, was one of the most grueling and decisive phases of the entire campaign. It was here in the desolate landscapes between Nicaea and Antioch that the Crusaders were forged into a more cohesive and battle-hardened force. They learned to fight together, to survive with less, and to adapt to the unfamiliar rhythms of the East. Their journey was no longer just a holy quest, it had become a crucible. Those who emerged from the wastes of Asia Minor were not the same men who had left their homes in Europe. They were leaner, grimmer, and more resolute. They had seen the price of their beliefs and paid for them in blood, sweat, and tears. And ahead of them still lay the fortified cities of the Levant, the deserts of Palestine, and finally, the walls of Jerusalem. After enduring the brutal journey through Asia Minor, the crusading armies arrived at the edges of northern Syria and Mesopotamia, a region filled with fortified cities, powerful Muslim rulers, and complex local politics. The morale of the Crusaders was battered but not broken. Their march had forged unity through shared suffering, and their eyes were now set on key strongholds that could both replenish their forces and provide strategic footholds on the road to Jerusalem. Two cities in particular, Edessa and Antioch, would become pivotal moments in the First Crusade, marking both triumph and tragedy, and dramatically altering the political landscape of the Near East. The first of these cities was Edessa, located in Upper Mesopotamia. Though not originally part of the main Crusader objective, Edessa became a crucial target due to its vulnerability and strategic value. The opportunity arose when Baldwin of Bologna, the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, broke away from the main crusading force and traveled eastward, hoping to establish his own power base. Baldwin was a skilled diplomat and military leader, and he quickly recognized the discontent among the Christian Armenian population of Edessa, who were under the rule of Thoros, a Greek Orthodox governor, with tenuous control and little popular support. Baldwin exploited these divisions, allying with local Armenian nobles and positioning himself as a protector of their faith and culture. In early 1098, Thoros adopted Baldwin as his heir, hoping to stabilize his regime, but tensions soon escalated. Within weeks, Thoros was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, an event that some sources attribute directly or indirectly to Baldwin's ambition. With Thoros gone, Baldwin assumed control and declared himself Count of Edessa, establishing the first Crusader state in the Levant. Though born of opportunism and intrigue, the county of Edessa became a vital stronghold for the Crusaders. It provided a secure eastern flank, a source of resources and manpower, and a powerful symbol of Christian resurgence in formerly Islamic lands. Baldwin's success demonstrated that the crusade was not only about reaching Jerusalem, it also offered ambitious nobles the chance to carve out realms of their own. Meanwhile, the main body of the crusading army continued southward, their next major objective being the ancient city of Antioch. One of the most important cities in the eastern Mediterranean, Antioch was heavily fortified and strategically located on the Orontes River, guarding the approach to Palestine. Its capture was seen as essential to the success of the crusade, but taking it would prove to be a long and agonizing ordeal. The siege of Antioch began in October 1097 and would last more than 7 months, testing the limits of the Crusaders' endurance and unity. Antioch was surrounded by massive walls protected by multiple towers and natural defenses. The defenders under the command of the Turkish governor Yagi Siyan were well prepared and determined to resist. The Crusaders lacked siege equipment and faced immediate shortages of food and supplies. Winter brought freezing temperatures and disease, while efforts to breach the walls failed repeatedly. Starvation became widespread, and morale plummeted. Some knights abandoned the siege entirely, fleeing in the night. Others resorted to eating their horses or foraging in hostile territory. The situation grew so desperate that acts of cannibalism were reportedly witnessed during the darkest days of the siege. Despite these horrors, the Crusaders refused to give up. Religious fervor kept many going. Priests held frequent processions, fasts, and public prayers, urging the soldiers to remain faithful. The turning point came through treachery, not force. Bohemond of Taranto negotiated secretly with an Armenian guard named Firuz, who controlled one of the towers. On the night of June 3, 1098, Firuz opened a gate and allowed the Crusaders to scale the walls from within. Once inside, the Christian forces overwhelmed the city and massacred thousands of defenders. Antioch was theirs, but their suffering was far from over. Just days after capturing the city, the Crusaders found themselves besieged in turn by a large Muslim army led by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Trapped within the very city they had just conquered, with dwindling supplies and no hope of reinforcements, the Crusaders prepared for a final stand. Once again, religious belief played a decisive role. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions from St. Andrew, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side, buried beneath a church in Antioch. When the relic was allegedly found, it sparked a wave of renewed zeal and unity among the Crusaders. Whether genuine or fabricated, the discovery inspired them to make one last desperate attack. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders launched a surprise sortie against Kerboga's forces and achieved a miraculous victory. Disorganized and plagued by internal divisions, Kerboga's army collapsed under the assault. The Crusaders had not only survived, they had won. Their capture of Antioch and the defeat of Kerboga represented one of the greatest military and spiritual triumphs of the First Crusade. But the cost had been staggering. Tens of thousands had died during the siege, and relations among the Crusader leaders had become strained. Bohemond, who had orchestrated the city's capture, claimed Antioch for himself, despite earlier promises to return it to the Byzantines. This decision led to a major political rift and set a precedent for other Crusader leaders to pursue their own territorial ambitions, often at the expense of unity and shared purpose. The captures of Edessa and Antioch thus represented a turning point in the crusade. They showcased the Crusaders' resilience, their willingness to use both faith and cunning, and the growing divide between the original spiritual aims of the movement and the personal ambitions of its leaders. These victories provided critical staging grounds for the final push toward Jerusalem. but they also revealed the internal contradictions of the crusade. What had begun as a unified march under the banner of Christ was rapidly evolving into a fragmented campaign shaped by politics, power, and the quest for personal dominion. After the fall of Antioch, the crusading armies had little time to rest or reflect. Although they had survived a brutal siege and overcome one of the strongest Muslim counterattacks of the campaign, their ultimate objective, Jerusalem, remained unrealized. The holy city loomed ahead as both a promise and a challenge. The survivors of Antioch were weary, diminished in number, and divided in leadership, but they were determined to complete what they had begun. In January 1099, after spending months securing supplies, rebuilding strength, and negotiating power struggles among themselves, the Crusaders resumed their march southward through the Levant, carrying with them the hope of Christendom and the burden of a long and bloody road behind them. The march toward Jerusalem was neither swift nor simple. Though the distance from Antioch to Jerusalem was only several hundred miles, the journey was filled with logistical and spiritual challenges. The Crusaders passed through a series of semi-independent cities and territories, some of which were ruled by Muslim leaders who sought to avoid direct conflict. Others resisted and had to be taken by force. The terrain ranged from rocky hills to arid plains, with the occasional fertile valley or friendly village. The weather was often punishing, searing daytime heat gave way to bitterly cold nights. Supplies were scarce, and the risk of ambush remained constant. Desertion and disease continued to chip away at the army's numbers. Yet through it all, the Crusaders pressed forward, driven by the vision of Jerusalem and the spiritual rewards that awaited them. Religious fervor intensified with every mile. As they neared the holy city, the Crusaders began to see their journey not only as a military campaign, but as a sacred pilgrimage. Many believed they were reliving biblical prophecy and walking in the footsteps of saints and martyrs. Priests led processions, sang hymns, and conducted mass to keep morale high and reinforce the spiritual meaning of their cause. The suffering endured thus far, hunger wounds, the deaths of comrades, was interpreted as part of a divine test, a purification through which they were being prepared for the final confrontation. For many, the thought of dying in sight of Jerusalem was not a tragedy, but a blessing. Tensions among the leaders remained a constant concern. Bohemond, having claimed Antioch for himself, refused to continue south, choosing instead to consolidate his new principality. His absence created a power vacuum that needed careful negotiation. Raymond of Toulouse attempted to assume overall leadership, but his ambitions were contested by Godfrey of Bouillon and other nobles. Despite these rivalries, a pragmatic truce emerged, and the remaining leaders agreed to continue the campaign together. Their focus was clear: reach Jerusalem, capture it, and fulfill the oath many had made when they took up the cross. Along the way, the Crusaders received unexpected assistance from local Christian populations, particularly Armenians, Syrians, and Maronites, who provided intelligence shelter and occasional military support. These communities, long marginalized under Islamic rule, viewed the Crusaders as liberators, though this perception would later become more complicated. In some towns, the Crusaders negotiated peaceful passage. In others, they resorted to siege and battle. Despite these challenges, their discipline and determination held, and by early June 1099, they arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem. The city, now under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, had been recently retaken from the Seljuk Turks and was garrisoned by a diverse force of Muslim troops. The Fatimids, aware of the Crusader approach, had fortified the defenses and expelled most of the city's Christian population, fearing they might aid the attackers. The arrival of the Crusaders was met with both military preparation and a psychological campaign. Inside the city. Rumors spread about the ferocity of the Crusaders, while outside the walls, the Christian army struggled to comprehend the enormity of their task. After nearly 3 years of marching, fighting, and suffering, they now faced the final obstacle, one of the most fortified and sacred cities in the world. Before launching the siege, the Crusaders held a religious procession around the city's walls. Barefoot and singing, they retraced the supposed path Christ took during his passion, seeking divine favor and guidance. The event, though symbolic, reinforced their unity and resolve. For them, this was not simply a battle, it was a spiritual reckoning. They were not merely soldiers. They were the instruments of God, chosen to reclaim his city. The memory of friends lost at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, Edessa, and Antioch burned in their minds. They had come too far to fail now. As the siege preparations began, engineers and soldiers alike worked feverishly to construct siege towers, ladders, and other equipment, using whatever materials they could find, mostly timber from nearby forests and dismantled buildings. Food remained scarce, and the heat of the Palestinian summer added to the misery. Yet unlike the drawn-out agony of Antioch, this siege would be swift and decisive. Within weeks, the stage would be set for one of the most dramatic and consequential assaults of the medieval world. The march toward Jerusalem had not only been a journey across continents, but also a transformation of purpose, leadership, and identity. The Crusaders were no longer naive pilgrims or opportunistic nobles. They had become a hardened force molded by fire and faith. Ahead of them stood their final trial. The walls of Jerusalem were tall, but their determination and belief in divine providence stood taller. By early July 1099, the Crusaders had reached the culmination of their long and arduous journey. The city of Jerusalem stood before them, sacred and imposing. For many, it was a moment of awe and vindication, the physical and spiritual climax of years of hardship, suffering, and bloodshed. But between them and their divine prize rose the city's massive stone walls, encircled with towers, battlements, and determined defenders. Jerusalem was now under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, and its Egyptian garrison, led by Iftikhar al-Dawla, had prepared for the impending siege. Though the Crusader army was significantly smaller than it had been at the start of the campaign, reduced to an estimated 12,000 infantry and 1,500 knights, it remained fueled by religious conviction and hardened by experience. With no reinforcements on the horizon and no possibility of retreat, the Crusaders prepared for what would become one of the most iconic and brutal sieges in medieval history. The siege officially began on June 7, 10. At first, the Crusaders faced enormous logistical challenges. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare by the defenders in anticipation of their arrival. Water was scarce, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly. To add to their difficulties, the Crusaders lacked siege engines and the necessary materials to build them. Initial assaults on the city's walls were repelled with ease by the Fatimid defenders, who used arrows, boiling oil, and stones to keep the attackers at bay. Morale faltered as days turned into weeks, and the city remained firmly in enemy hands. But unlike previous setbacks in the campaign, the urgency of Jerusalem's capture and the promise of eternal salvation drove the Crusaders to press on. Under the leadership of key figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Tancred, the Crusaders began constructing siege towers and battering rams. Scouts located timber in nearby forests, and every able-bodied man was put to work gathering and assembling materials. Naval support from Genoese sailors who had arrived at Jaffa also proved instrumental. They provided skilled labor and tools to hasten construction. By mid-July, 2 massive siege towers had been built and wheeled into position opposite different sections of the city wall, one near the north wall under Godfrey's command, the other near the southwest under Raymond's leadership. The final assault was set for July 14th. That night, as the siege towers were moved under cover of darkness, the Crusaders prayed fervently. Fasts had been held in the days leading up to the attack. Some went barefoot, others carried relics or icons, and priests offered mass and absolution. The sense of divine mission was overwhelming. For the Crusaders, this was not merely a military offensive, it was a holy act, the fulfillment of a sacred vow. At dawn on July 15th, the final assault began. The siege towers rolled forward under a hail of arrows and rocks. As they approached the walls, defenders intensified their fire, setting one of the towers ablaze. But Godfrey's tower held, and under its cover, his men scaled the walls with ladders and drew their swords. By midday, a breach had been made in the northern Pilau. Godfrey's men poured through, fighting street by street, as panic spread among the city's defenders. Soon Tancred's forces followed, breaking into the city from the northeast. Chaos ensued. The Fatimid garrison collapsed under the relentless pressure, and Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders' control. What followed, however, would leave a dark stain on the legacy of the First Crusade. Once inside the city, the Crusaders unleashed a massacre on the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, describe scenes of indiscriminate slaughter in mosques, streets, and homes. Blood, it was said, ran ankle-deep in some areas. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, 2 of Islam's holiest sites, were sites of carnage and plunder. The massacre was not merely a byproduct of war. It was fueled by a potent mix of revenge, religious zealotry, and exhaustion. Many Crusaders believed that killing non-Christians in the Holy City was not only justified, but divinely ordained. The violence lasted for several days, with few spared. Even Jews who had taken refuge in synagogues were burned alive or executed. These acts shocked the Islamic world and deepened the rift between Muslim and Christian societies for generations. Although some clergy and commanders like Tancred reportedly attempted to protect certain civilians, their efforts were limited and often ignored by the raging crowd. In the aftermath, the Crusaders sought to restore Christian rites and symbols in the city. Churches were reconsecrated, particularly the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to house Christ's tomb. Religious ceremonies were held to celebrate the victory, and some leaders undertook barefoot processions to sacred sites in a gesture of piety and humility. Godfrey of Bouillon, refusing the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, accepted instead the title Protector of the Holy Sepulchre. His appointment marked the beginning of Christian rule in Jerusalem and the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which would serve as the spiritual and political heart of the Crusader states. The siege and capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 was the climactic moment of the First Crusade. It marked the only time in the history of the Crusades that Western Christian forces successfully captured and held the city for any significant period. The military feat, though astonishing given the dwindled size and limited resources of the army, was overshadowed by the brutal violence that followed. For the Crusaders, it was a moment of religious ecstasy, the culmination of years of suffering and sacrifice. For the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city, it was a catastrophe of historic proportions. And for the world, it was the beginning of a new and turbulent chapter in East-West relations. With the conquest of Jerusalem in July 1099, the First Crusade reached its triumphant conclusion. But it was also the beginning of a complex and lasting transformation in the political and religious structure of the Middle East. The capture of the Holy City was not merely a symbolic victory. It created the need for a permanent Christian presence in a region surrounded by hostile forces. The Crusaders could not simply return home and leave Jerusalem unguarded. To ensure the survival of their gains, they established new political entities known as the Crusader states. These were Western-style feudal kingdoms transplanted into the Levant, ruled by European nobles who sought to maintain and defend the fragile gains of the Crusade. The most prominent of these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which would become the centerpiece of Latin Christendom in the East for nearly a century. Immediately following the conquest, a debate erupted among the Crusader leaders over who would govern the Holy City. While many had returned home after fulfilling their vows, the remaining lords were divided in ambition and vision. Some sought spiritual authority. Others desired titles, land, and wealth. Raymond of Toulouse was one of the most senior and respected leaders, but he declined to take the crown, reportedly saying he would not wear a golden crown where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. His refusal may have stemmed from genuine piety, political caution, or a desire to avoid conflict. Ultimately, the mantle of leadership fell to Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, whose reputation for piety and martial strength earned him the support of his peers. Godfrey, however, also refused the title of king. Instead, he accepted the more humble and religiously resonant title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, symbolizing his role not as a sovereign ruler, but as the protector of Christ's tomb. His modesty may have been genuine, or it may have been a strategic gesture to gain favor with the church and the Christian population of the city. Regardless, Godfrey quickly set about organizing the defense and administration of Jerusalem. He installed Latin clergy in key religious positions, including appointing a Latin patriarch to replace the Greek Orthodox bishop, thus aligning the city's church hierarchy with Roman Catholic authority. This reshaping of religious institutions helped solidify Western control and marginalize other Christian sects. In the months that followed, the other Crusader states began to take shape. Beyond Jerusalem, Crusader leaders seized and settled in surrounding regions, establishing independent territories modeled on European feudal systems. These included the county of Edessa, which Baldwin of Boulogne had already established, even before the capture of Jerusalem. When Godfrey died unexpectedly in 1100, Baldwin abandoned Edessa and returned to Jerusalem, where he was crowned King Baldwin I, officially ending the refusal of a royal title and solidifying the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a proper monarchy. Other states quickly followed. In the north, Bohemond of Taranto established the Principality of Antioch, using his claim from the Siege of Antioch to carve out a semi-autonomous region under his control. His cousin Tancred acted as regent while Bohemond was held captive and later as prince in his own right. Further south, Raymond of Toulouse founded the county of Tripoli, though it would not be fully established until years later after prolonged conflict and negotiation. These four principal Crusader states, Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, formed the backbone of Latin Christendom in the East and became known collectively as the Outre-mer, or the land beyond the sea. The establishment of these states marked a significant shift in the nature of the crusading movement. What had begun as a spiritual mission evolved into a colonial enterprise complete with fortresses, castles, trade networks, and aristocratic courts. European settlers, mainly from France, Italy, and Germany, began to migrate to the region, intermingling with local Christian communities such as Armenians, Syrians, and Maronites. In many cases, these relationships were practical and even cooperative. However, tensions also simmered, particularly with Muslim populations and Eastern Christian sects who were often treated as second-class citizens under Latin rule. Governance structures mirrored those of Western Europe, with lords, vassals, and serfs. Yet the constant threat of Muslim reconquest gave these states a militarized and often fragile character. Despite their initial success, the Crusader states were constantly under pressure. Their existence relied heavily on continuous military readiness, diplomatic alliances with Eastern Christian states, and intermittent reinforcements from Europe. The geography of the region, isolated, surrounded by enemies, and difficult to defend, meant that survival was never guaranteed. Local Muslim rulers soon began to regroup and resist the Latin presence, and although the initial Muslim response was fragmented, the seeds of a counter-crusade were already being planted. Nevertheless, in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, the mood among Christians in Europe and the Levant was celebratory. Pilgrims began to travel to Jerusalem in greater numbers, now able to visit sacred sites under Latin protection. Churches were restored and fortified. Trade routes reopened and expanded, creating new commercial ties between the East and West. The Kingdom of Jerusalem served not only as a spiritual beacon, but also as a cultural and economic bridge, however tenuous, between Latin Europe and the Islamic world. For the papacy, the establishment of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was proof of divine favor and ecclesiastical legitimacy. It demonstrated that through the unity of faith and arms, Christendom could reshape the world. The creation of the Crusader states, and especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was one of the most enduring legacies of the First Crusade. These states institutionalized the crusading ideal into everyday governance and made the concept of holy war a permanent fixture in both European politics and Christian doctrine. They would stand for nearly 2 centuries, alternately flourishing and faltering, before eventually falling to Muslim reconquest. But in 1099, the Crusaders believed they had completed a sacred task. Jerusalem was once again in Christian hands, and a new order had been born in the East. The successful conclusion of the First Crusade and the establishment of Christian control over Jerusalem had a profound and far-reaching impact on Europe. Though the immediate focus was the Holy Land, the consequences of the Crusade rippled throughout the continent in political, religious, economic, and cultural ways. Europe emerged from the experience not only with new territorial holdings in the East, but also with a transformed sense of its own identity and purpose. The Crusade had begun as a spiritual mission, but it ended up reshaping the structures of power and influence across Western Christendom. It bolstered the prestige of the papacy, redefined the role of the Church in secular affairs, and opened new channels of interaction between East and West that would influence everything from trade to theology. One of the most immediate outcomes of the Crusade was the dramatic increase in the power and authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Pope Urban II had not only initiated the Crusade, but had managed to unify a fragmented and often combative Europe under a single religious cause. His vision of Christendom bound together by faith and purpose found new life in the victory at Jerusalem. Although Urban died shortly after the city's capture, his legacy endured. Subsequent popes capitalized on the momentum, using the idea of crusade to further extend papal influence over kings, nobles, and lay people alike. The Church had proven it could lead not just spiritually, but militarily and politically. In the years that followed, the crusading movement became a permanent tool of the papacy, with future campaigns often initiated or sanctioned by Rome to enforce its will or defend its interests. The First Crusade also reinvigorated religious devotion and practice across Europe. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land surged, with thousands of Christians undertaking the journey to Jerusalem to visit sacred sites now held by fellow believers. The return of relics, stories, and artifacts from the East deepened fascination with biblical history and fueled the construction of new churches and monasteries. Popular literature, art, and music absorbed the crusading theme, portraying knights as holy warriors and martyrs for the faith. The crusade helped solidify the ideal of the Christian knight as both a soldier and a servant of God, a model that became central to medieval European culture. Religious orders such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers emerged directly from the crusading effort, blending monastic discipline with military function and becoming powerful institutions in their own right. Economically, the crusade acted as a catalyst for increased interaction and commerce between East and West. The logistical demands of the expedition, from transporting thousands of men to supplying food, weapons, and horses, required cooperation between diverse regions and stimulated markets across the Mediterranean. Italian maritime republics, such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, played a crucial role in shipping and provisioning the Crusaders, and in return, they gained valuable trade privileges in the new Crusader states. These cities soon established commercial colonies in ports like Acre and Tyre, creating networks that allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Spices, textiles, glassware, and scientific knowledge began to flow more freely, planting the seeds for the later commercial expansion that would define the Renaissance and beyond. Politically, the Crusade altered the balance of power within Europe itself. Nobles who had participated in the campaign returned with enhanced prestige and, in some cases, with new titles and wealth acquired in the East. Some families rose in status and influence, using their crusade credentials to gain political leverage at home. Conversely, The absence or death of lords during the campaign created opportunities for kings and monarchs to consolidate control over their lands. In France and England, royal authority began to strengthen as centralized governance became more appealing in the face of feudal instability. While the First Crusade did not unify Europe under a single ruler, it did encourage greater cohesion among Christian states and demonstrated the potential for continental-scale mobilization, a lesson not lost on later rulers. The Crusade also had a significant cultural and psychological effect on European society. It introduced many Europeans to new customs, foods, and architectural styles. Even those who did not participate in the expedition were influenced by returning crusaders who shared tales of exotic cities, strange languages, and advanced technologies. While much of the interaction was filtered through the lens of religious conflict, it nonetheless broadened European awareness of the wider world. The East was no longer just a distant concept. It was a place of real people, cultures, and political systems, some of which were respected, others feared, and many deeply misunderstood. This expanding worldview helped break down some of the intellectual isolation that had characterized early medieval Europe. Importantly, the First Crusade redefined the concept of holy war. Prior to the Crusades, the Church had generally condemned warfare, urging peace among Christian rulers and promoting the idea of the peace and truce of God movement. But the Crusade had reframed violence as a legitimate, even righteous act when carried out in defense of the faith. This new doctrine allowed future conflicts, whether against Muslims, pagans, heretics, or political enemies, to be sanctified under religious justification. It created a precedent for church-sanctioned violence that would echo through the Inquisition, the Albigensian Crusade, and later colonization efforts justified as Christian missions. The spiritual authority of the Church was now tied to its willingness to command armies and wage war. In short, the First Crusade ushered in a new era in Europe. It strengthened the Church, expanded trade and communication, altered the political landscape, and left an indelible mark on European identity. It taught Europe that it could project power far beyond its borders, and that faith, politics, and warfare could be fused into a single driving force. Yet it also opened Europe to new challenges, rivalries, and cultural confrontations. The reverberations of the First Crusade would be felt for generations, not only in the Holy Land, but in the very heart of Europe itself. While the First Crusade was hailed as a monumental triumph in Christian Europe, its effects on the Islamic world and the broader Middle East were catastrophic, traumatic, and ultimately transformative. The fall of Jerusalem and the establishment of Crusader states struck a devastating psychological and political blow to the Muslim world. Initially caught off guard by the sudden and coordinated Western incursion, Muslim rulers and communities across the region struggled to comprehend and respond to this unprecedented invasion. But over time, the shock of the First Crusade would galvanize a new era of Islamic resistance and unity, laying the groundwork for powerful counterattacks and the emergence of some of the most iconic leaders in Islamic history. The impact of the Crusade on the Islamic world was not only military and territorial, it also reshaped religious discourse, diplomatic strategies, and cultural memory in ways that continue to resonate centuries later. At the time of the First Crusade, the Muslim world was deeply fragmented. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had lost much of its centralized control, and the Islamic world was divided into competing dynasties, emirs, and sultans. The Seljuk Turks held power in much of Anatolia and Syria, but their empire was decentralized, and rivalries between regional commanders undermined unified defense efforts. In Egypt, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate ruled Jerusalem, creating an additional sectarian divide that further weakened Muslim resistance. These divisions allowed the Crusaders to exploit local political instability, advancing through the Levant with relatively little coordinated opposition. Cities like Edessa and Antioch fell not because the Muslims lacked strength, but because they lacked cohesion. The siege and eventual fall of Jerusalem in 1099 represented the culmination of this disunity, a symbol of the high cost of division in the face of a determined and ideologically driven enemy. The violence and brutality of the First Crusade's final stages left a deep scar on Muslim consciousness. The massacre that followed the capture of Jerusalem, where thousands of Muslim civilians, including women and children, were slaughtered, was seen as not only a military loss, but a profound moral outrage. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers such as Ibn al-Qalanisi and later Ibn al-Athir documented the events with horror and sorrow. These accounts described the bloodshed in vivid detail, emphasizing the desecration of holy places and the failure of Muslim rulers to protect their people. The fall of Jerusalem was not just a territorial loss. It was a spiritual humiliation, a moment of collective crisis that demanded both reflection and retaliation. Over the following decades, these narratives would serve as rallying cries for jihad, holy struggle against the invaders, fueling future conflicts, and defining Muslim attitudes toward crusaders for generations. In the years immediately following the crusade, Muslim responses were slow and uncoordinated. Local rulers attempted sporadic counterattacks, but the Crusader states were able to consolidate their holdings and establish fortified cities, garrisons, and supply routes. However, as the initial shock began to subside, a new generation of Muslim leaders emerged more pragmatic, more unified, and deeply motivated by the need to reclaim lost lands. This period saw the rise of powerful dynasties, such as the Zengids and later the Ayyubids. Figures like Imad ad-Din Zengi and Nur ad-Din began the process of militarizing Islamic resistance and promoting a unified Sunni front against the Crusader presence. Their efforts set the stage for the most iconic Muslim leader of the Crusades, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin would become the embodiment of Islamic resistance, admired even by his Christian enemies for his honor, military skill, and statesmanship. In 1187, nearly a century after the First Crusade, he would recapture Jerusalem in the Battle of Hattin. Significant outcomes of the initial Crusader conquest. But the roots of his success and the ideological framework that supported it can be traced directly to the trauma and lessons of the First Crusade. The Muslim world had learned that internal division was fatal, and that the Crusaders, though formidable, could be resisted and eventually expelled through unity strategy and spiritual resilience. Beyond military consequences, the First Crusade had lasting religious and cultural implications for the Islamic world. It revived and reshaped the concept of jihad, which had fallen into relative dormancy during the earlier periods of Islamic expansion. The call to arms became more urgent and popular, and religious scholars began to write extensively on the moral and legal justification for war against Christian invaders. Mosques and madrasas promoted sermons that emphasized the defense of Islam martyrdom and the sanctity of Jerusalem, known in Arabic as Al-Quds, the Holy. Religious discourse shifted to include a stronger focus on resisting foreign domination, and the cultural memory of the Crusades became embedded in Islamic education, art, and identity. The First Crusade also altered diplomatic relations between Muslim and Christian states. While trade and occasional truces continued, trust was deeply eroded. Muslim leaders became more wary of Western intentions and political alliances with European powers, while sometimes necessary, were increasingly seen as dangerous compromises. The presence of permanent Crusader states created a new geopolitical reality in the region, one in which Muslims had to constantly contend with fortified Christian enclaves backed by distant European powers. This constant state of vigilance and conflict hardened political structures and influenced the development of military institutions throughout the Islamic world. In the long term, the First Crusade contributed to a growing sense of historical grievance and cultural memory that still resonates in parts of the modern Muslim world. The Crusader invasions are often cited in modern political rhetoric and historical narratives, particularly in the context of Western intervention in the Middle East. Though the events occurred nearly a millennium ago, they are remembered as early episodes of Western aggression, colonialism, and religious hostility. The legacy of the Crusades, starting with the brutal shock of the first, remains part of the dialogue around identity resistance and sovereignty in many Muslim-majority societies today. In summary, the First Crusade was a profound and devastating experience for the Islamic world. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a divided Muslim society, inflicted immense suffering, and led to the loss of one of Islam's most sacred cities. But it also awakened a powerful response, one that would over time unite factions, inspire leaders, and eventually lead to the reconquest of many Crusader-held territories. The memory of the First Crusade is one of both tragedy and resurgence in Islamic history, a story of loss that sparked revival and of defeat that laid the foundation for future triumph. The First Crusade was not simply a military campaign that ended with the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. It was a turning point in world history, whose effects endured long after the last sword was sheathed. Its legacy can be found in the evolution of religious warfare, the shaping of East-West relations, and the foundations of modern perceptions of cultural and religious identity. Unlike many medieval conflicts that faded into the background of history, the First Crusade carved deep channels into the collective memory of both Christian and Muslim civilizations. It marked the beginning of a 2-century-long series of holy wars, set precedents for religiously justified violence, and laid the groundwork for lasting geopolitical and ideological divisions. One of the most profound legacies of the First Crusade was the transformation of religious warfare into a permanent institution in Christian Europe. Prior to the Crusades, warfare, even when necessary, was generally viewed by the Church as a moral liability, something that required penance or atonement. The First Crusade reversed that paradigm. By framing war as a path to salvation, Pope Urban II redefined the role of violence in Christian life. Killing in defense of the faith or in pursuit of holy objectives became not only acceptable but virtuous. This new ideology of holy war would influence church policy for generations, justifying not only later crusades to the Holy Land, but also campaigns against heretics in Europe, the expansion into pagan lands in the Baltic region, and even later colonial ventures under a Christian banner. This concept of divinely sanctioned warfare inspired the creation of military religious orders like the Knights Templar Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights groups that combined monastic vows with martial duties. These institutions gained extraordinary power and wealth, and they served as permanent symbols of the crusading ideal. Their military prowess, administrative skill, and religious commitment allowed them to dominate frontier zones, protect pilgrims, and build fortified castles throughout the Crusader states. These orders became transnational forces that operated across borders, and their legacy can still be seen in modern cultural depictions of chivalry knighthood and religious militancy. The First Crusade also had an enduring impact on Christian-Muslim relations, shaping perceptions that still linger today. For many Muslims, the Crusades were remembered not simply as a historical episode, but as a long-standing aggression from the Christian West, a violation of sacred lands, and a brutal reminder of religious intolerance. The memory of the massacres at Jerusalem and the forced conversions and occupations that followed became embedded in Islamic historiography, fueling both anger and resistance in the centuries that followed. For Christians, the Crusade was remembered as a heroic effort, a divine victory, an affirmation of God's favor. These divergent narratives created a legacy of mistrust, antagonism, and cultural misunderstanding that has periodically resurfaced in later conflicts, from the Reconquista and Ottoman Christian wars to modern political tensions in the Middle East. Culturally, the First Crusade initiated a greater exchange between East and West, though not always on equal or peaceful terms. Crusaders returned with new knowledge, customs, and goods that would influence European art, science, medicine, and cuisine. Contact with the Islamic world, despite being filtered through war and hostility, sparked curiosity and admiration in some circles. Arabic numerals, classical Greek texts preserved by Muslim scholars, advanced surgical techniques, and exotic spices all made their way into Western Europe, contributing to a gradual intellectual awakening that would eventually culminate in the Renaissance. Thus, the First Crusade, while violent and disruptive, also served as a bridge, albeit a turbulent one, between civilizations. The First Crusade also profoundly influenced the concept of Christian unity and European identity. Although Europe was politically fragmented, the Crusade gave rise to the notion that Christians across linguistic, national, and cultural lines could unite under a single cause. This sense of spiritual solidarity would be invoked in later centuries to justify other pan-European projects, both noble and ignoble. The idea that Europe had a shared religious destiny and that it should act collectively in defense of that destiny helped define European consciousness well beyond the medieval era. Moreover, the First Crusade became a mythic and symbolic reference point for later generations. In literature, it was idealized in epic poetry and knightly romances. Chronicles and religious texts celebrated its martyrs and glorified its leaders. In politics, rulers would cite their crusading ancestors to legitimize claims of authority. The imagery of the crusade, cross-bearing warriors, fortified castles, and divine triumph became deeply embedded in Western iconography. Even in the modern era, the term crusade continues to be invoked in political and cultural rhetoric, often stripped of its historical nuance but still charged with emotional and ideological power. Yet the legacy of the First Crusade was not without ambiguity. The movement that had promised spiritual salvation also brought suffering, displacement, and mass violence. The Crusaders, though driven by faith, were also motivated by ambition, greed, and vengeance. The sanctification of war led to consequences that church leaders could not fully control, including pogroms against Jews in Europe and infighting among Crusader leaders. The territories gained were difficult to hold, and their defense would require repeated military efforts, ultimately draining European resources and leading to cycles of conquest and loss. The First Crusade had opened the door to a volatile new era in which faith and force were tightly bound, a door that would not close for centuries. Finally, the Crusade's enduring legacy can be measured by the long shadow it cast on global memory. For medieval Europeans, it was a peak moment of divine achievement. For Muslims, it was a painful chapter of invasion and injustice. For modern historians, it remains a subject of deep complexity, at once a religious movement, a colonial enterprise, a cultural encounter, and a geopolitical shift. Its consequences reshaped borders, ideologies, and institutions, and it set the stage for countless stories of conflict, exchange, and transformation that followed. The First Crusade, more than any other, became the model for all that came after, a symbol of both the heights of human conviction and the depths of human contradiction. The First Crusade was more than a medieval military expedition. It was a transformative event that reshaped the geopolitical, religious, and cultural landscapes of both Europe and the Middle East. Though framed as a righteous endeavor to reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom, the Crusade was driven by a complex web of motivations that extended far beyond pure faith. Ambitions for power, territorial expansion, economic opportunity, and political influence were all entwined with religious fervor. The campaign's immediate success in capturing Jerusalem and establishing Crusader states marked a high point of Christian unity and military achievement. But it also triggered cycles of violence, retaliation, and enduring hostility between faiths. For Europe, the Crusade elevated the authority of the papacy, expanded trade, and accelerated cultural exchange. For the Islamic world, it served as both a devastating blow and a rallying cry for resistance and reform. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of the First Crusade would live on not only in chronicles and monuments, but in the hearts, identities, and conflicts of peoples across continents. It was ultimately a defining moment in world history, a crucible of faith, war, ambition, and memory that continues to echo into the modern age.